Writer's Read by LiTracey, getting that book in children's hands.
Hi, I'm Tracy Grice and welcome to the Writer's Read podcast. I'm a teacher and I'm really passionate about getting kids reading. The inspiration for this podcast came from a quote by American author Nancy Atwell, and she says, "For students of every ability and background, it's the simple, miraculous act of reading a good book that turns them into readers. Because even for the least experienced, most reluctant reader, it's the one good book that changes everything. The job of adults who care about reading is to move heaven and earth to put that book into a child's hands." So this podcast is designed to do just that. It's not only a podcast that can help children and adolescents connect with authors and books, it's also a resource for parents, teachers, and librarians who are helping kids on their reading journey. This episode of the Writer's Read podcast puts the spotlight on something I'm really passionate about, and that's discovering and understanding who you are as a reader. I'm really excited to be chatting with Jane Sullivan about her new book, Storytime. Jane is a Melbourne-based writer specialising in literary journalism. She's worked for The Age as a reporter, feature writer and editor. Jane won the inaugural Australian Human Rights Award for journalism. Her first love, however, is writing fiction, and she's published 2 novels, The White Star and Little People, which was shortlisted for the Encore Award for a second novel. Jane currently writes Turning Pages, a Saturday column on books and writing for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and contributes occasional features, essays and interviews to numerous publications, including Australian Book Review. And with a resume like that, it's fair to say that I'm both humbled and honoured to firstly meet you, Jane, and secondly to chat about your latest book, a book which I think truly embodies what I'm passionate about sharing on the Writer's Read podcast. So Jane, a question I tend to ask most authors on my podcast is to reread or not to reread books. And this question is mixed with a range of responses. But in your latest book, Storytime, that's exactly what you did. You went back and reread books from your childhood. So what led you down this path?
Well, it's all those years I spent as a professional writing about books and thinking about books and so on, and reading some wonderful, great, fantastic novels by, the Russian writers and Dickens and all the great classics and so on, being very impressed by them. But at the same time, I've often thought that the books that impressed me most and that stayed with me most were the books I read between the ages of 7 and 11. And somehow I couldn't quite understand why it was that Enid Blyton trumped Tolstoy every time in my memory. And I became so fascinated by this that I thought, well, I'll go back and I'll have a look at those books again. Am I really remembering them correctly? Were they really that good? And of course there was the worry, am I going to be terribly disappointed? But I was also very excited and thrilled to think, I've got a good reason to read them again now, and I can write about what I discover.
So you mentioned in your book that this rereading has made you impatient, disappointed, contemptuous, amused, admiring, charmed, seduced, and a little bit uneasy. So what was it about the process of rereading that made you have all of these feelings?
It was very surprising. That was the funny thing. I was expecting to feel certain things, but I felt a whole range of things I wasn't expecting to feel. So I suppose the first and predominant thing I felt was enormous pleasure to rediscover these books that had meant so much to me. And on the whole, I was pleased and delighted all over again, which was great. So I read a book like, for example, The Wind and the Willows or the Alice books or Winnie the Pooh, and I was so charmed and delighted, and they was at least as good as I remembered, and in some ways they were better than I remembered because as an adult I could see things about them I hadn't seen as a child. And there were occasions when I was disappointed and the books were nothing like as good as I remember, but they were in the minority. And the other thing that surprised me was that some of the books had disturbed me and made me frightened at the time, and I felt some of that fear coming back again even after all these years, that reading these books tended to reawaken these fears and reminded me so clearly of what I'd felt at the time. And so I was rediscovering things about myself, not only just about the books, and that was extraordinary. So the whole journey was really an enormous journey of discovery for me, far more than I anticipated when I started out.
Right. So, straight off the bat in your book, you reflect on your earliest days of reading and you declare that you are a compulsive reader.
Yes.
So what was reading like, your reading life like as a child?
Well, I was the sort of child who just read anything and everything. If I was sitting at the breakfast table and I hadn't got a book, then I would read the writing on the back of the cornflakes packet. Mm-hmm. So I can still tell you, what the ingredients are in the cornflakes and what riboflavin is and all that, because it was on the packet. And, of course, the real thrill, though, was reading books. And I used to go to the local library and get books out, loads at a time, and then I'd fall in love with a favourite author and go back and try and find the same author again. Sometimes I had to wait, which was so infuriating for the book to come into the library. Mm-hmm. So it was a thrill. I was just completely hooked on reading. I was not interested in the books I had to read at school,
mm-hmm.
The Janet and John type. I grew up in England. We had these Janet and John books to help us read. They were so boring. I couldn't be bothered with those. It was the books that I found for myself in the library that were really thrilling. And occasionally someone gave me a book as a present that was also a wonderful thing to have.
So you mentioned going to the library, but did you own books? I notice in Storytime you talk about having to purchase some of these books again, that you haven't retained them from your childhood. So was book ownership a big part of your reading life?
Well, I did own some books, but they were very rarely books I bought myself. There were books that were given to me as presents by relatives and so on. And I used to really look forward to birthdays and Christmas, and there would be a book-shaped parcel. I thought, oh, great, I've got another book. And it was so disappointing when I opened the parcel and it turned out to be not a book, but some toy instead. That was a sad thing. And there was one occasion where I actually bought a book for myself, and that was when I won a competition. It was a competition to write a short story, which was run by a television show, and they sent me a little book voucher. So I was crazy about Enid Blyton at the time. So I went out and bought a book called The Castle of Adventure by Enid Blyton. But I don't know what happened to those books. They've all sort of disappeared. I've got very few of my original childhood books left. I found we're sitting here in my sister Julia's house in Adelaide, and in fact I got one of the books from Julia's bookcase. I was just looking around. Oh, there's the Moomin. No, we can't find the Moomin book, but there's a book called The Weird Stone of Brisingamen, which was given to me as a present, I think, on my 11th birthday.
Wow.
And it was still in the bookcase, in Julia's bookcase. So I said, right, I'll have that. I'm going to write about that.
Because it's quite often, people don't like to part with their books. It's something that they treasure and want to hold on to. So
I know. I don't quite know why it is that I lost those books. I've still got the original Winnie the Pooh books, two of them, and one of them is signed by Christopher Robin, which is a very, very treasured book. He signed it as an adult. Christopher Milne, his name is. But I was so nervous giving it to me, and he was so nervous signing it that he managed to sign it on the last page, and the signature's upside down.
Oh, wow.
But never mind. It's still his signature.
Absolutely. So even, despite the fact that you haven't kept your childhood books, what struck me when I was reading Storytime is the memories that you have of what you read as a child, and that you were so metacognitive from such an early age. You were really aware of your thinking about your reading, which is something, we teach in school.
Yeah.
But often it's that voice in your head that's talking to you while you read, that many of us aren't aware that voice is there telling us, helping us with our reactions and what we're thinking about the story. But you seem to be very aware from a young age.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting reading the book again, because what came back to me is not only the story itself, but what I thought about the story and my reaction to the story. And I could remember, of course, it was often a very naive child's reaction. It's not what I would think now. But the thoughts did come back. So it was a rediscovery. For example, when I read stories with male characters. Most of the books I read had male characters and very few females. And when I read that, I thought, well, okay, I'll just be the bloke in this book. I just identified with the male character. It seemed to come naturally, and I didn't worry about the fact there weren't enough female role models for me, which there should have been, but they weren't. So I thought, okay, I'll be the bloke in this book. fine.
And the other thing that was really interesting, that your parents didn't approve of you reading comics.
No,
in fact,
no.
thought they were vulgar.
Yeah, they didn't. We every Christmas as a special treat, they used to give us comics to read. So we would read things like the English comics were things like Beano and Dandy and so on. And Julia and I would absolutely devour these comics and love these comics. But that was it. That was all we got for a whole year. And funnily enough, I don't remember ever saving up my pocket money to buy comics. I saved it up to buy books. So maybe my parents did have a bit of a lesson in there somewhere.
Well, this once challenged reading material is really becoming commonplace in classrooms now, and in fact part of classroom curriculum. So you're a little bit ahead of your time when you were reading them as a child. The other thing I was shocked to read was that in the 1950s and 60s, excessive reading for pleasure was met with the same suspicion that screen time has in this day and age. So did you feel pressure to become a bit of an underground reader?
Yeah, I was a bit of a secretive reader. I remember at school we would have the proper book that we're supposed to be reading on the desk, and we had those desks with lids. So I would lift up the lid of my desk and I'd be secretly reading the book underneath when I was supposed to be reading the book on top. The book underneath was far more interesting.
Oh, I can imagine.
And I suppose I did a bit of secret reading at home too. I mean, my parents were quite encouraging of reading. They thought it was a good thing, but they also thought I should go outdoors and play. And sometimes I just didn't want to go outdoors and play. I wanted to read my book, so I'd just curl up somewhere and hope they wouldn't discover me.
And so let's fast forward to your adult life now. Reading's obviously a huge part of the work that you're involved with. But outside of work, do you continue to read for pleasure?
I do. It's getting harder and harder to find the time because practically every book I pick up and read is one I have to read for work. It's something I'm going to write about in my column, or I'm going to interview the author or something like that. Or for my book group, I'm going to read a book. So it's really hard to find the books that I like to read for pleasure, but I still find them and I still manage to fit them in, squeeze them in between the others. Yeah.
Brilliant. In life, there seems to be a bit of a coming of age as a reader where you get to leave behind those Janet and John type readers that you had at school, and you make your own way in the world as a reader. And now that you've had this fabulous opportunity to look back and reflect on your life as a reader, did books seem to find you at just the right time, or were you seeking something from the books that you chose to read?
I think there's a bit of both. I think I spent the whole book really trying to analyse what it was I needed from these books, and I kept coming up with these hypotheses of the sort of things I needed, and then I'd read another book which would completely destroy the hypothesis, and I'd have to go back to the beginning again. Like, for example, I thought I needed good writing. I didn't need good writing because one of the writers I was in love with is Enid Blyton, and I discovered on rereading Enid Blyton that she's a terrible writer. She's shockingly bad, and my inner critic was sort of screaming at me all the way through when I read this book, saying, how could you possibly have loved this writer? So then I had to think quite hard about what it was that I loved about this book if it wasn't the writing. And it was the idea of children going off on adventures on their own without their parents, spending time with their siblings and friends, having wonderful food. There's usually animals in the story. They're usually routing awful villains. They're having a terrific adventure. And all these things were really important to me. And I think the adventure thing was the most important thing of all, because I was a fairly privileged middle-class child growing up in a very comfortable family. But I wanted to have a hard time. I wanted to be stuck in tunnels, and I wanted to be getting out there and foiling villains. But I wasn't sure I wanted it that much just to do it in real life, but I was okay doing it in the pages of a book. That was a good compromise.
Yeah, for sure. And so what have you learnt about yourself as a reader through the process of writing Storytime?
Well, I've learnt to be a bit easier on myself, because my impression of my childhood was that I was a very shy, nervous, introverted child, very lacking in self-confidence, and that I hid away with books to escape from the world. Now, there was some truth in that, but I also discovered that I was a very enterprising child who would change the story to suit my narrative and to suit what I needed. And I was quite inventive and resourceful and bold in the way that I would read these works. And so I changed my opinion of myself. I was really more, I had resources in myself I didn't know I had. And I decided to be a bit easier on my childhood self and not be so cross with myself for escaping into books. Escaping into books was actually a good thing to do and a constructive thing to do, and it taught me more about the real world. It wasn't just a way of getting away from the real world, particularly things like dealing with fear. My childhood books were very good at helping me to deal with fear, because I would deal with terrifying situations on a daily basis to points where I would hardly sleep at night. The stories were so scary, but they got me through that. They got me out the other side. So I think I'm much kinder to myself, my childhood self, now than I used to be, I think, after this experience.
Good. Now, possibly my favourite chapter in the book was Mama on the Bookshelf.
Oh, yes, the Moomins, yes.
And in part, it's my favourite because I really identify with a Moomin Mama. So much.
Good, you do too.
Yes.
That's good to know.
But as literary fate would have it, I was travelling through Finland with my family when I was reading this very chapter.
Oh, wonderful. Perfect timing.
It was perfect timing. I guess I wondered what it was about Moomin Mama that enamors you so much.
Well, it's interesting because when I first read the Moomin books, the character I identified most was Moomin Troll, who's her son. He's the main character. And I saw myself as Moomin Troll, having these adventures and having these friends and going out and being bold and so on. And Moomin Mama was just this background character. She wasn't really very important to me as a child. But when I read it again, I suppose, being a mother myself now, I began to think, everyone's having such fun and going out there and doing all these things, and who's the person doing all the work and supporting them behind the scenes? It's Moomin Mama. Mm-hmm. She's there all the time, and she's such a kind and loving and supportive and generous person to a fault. She doesn't do anything for herself. It's always for the others, and she carries around this huge handbag which is always full of all these useful things. I particularly remember something called tummy powder, because everybody used to get a bit sick sooner or later, and she gave them tummy powder and warm socks and things like that. She's a very practical mum. And I just fell in love with her. I thought she was this superb character. And I got quite worried for her. I thought, but she should have a life of her own too, And I began to think of my own mother and how she'd been a sort of 50s housewife, but in her previous life she'd been an artist, and a very good one. And she'd kind of sacrificed her career to become a mother. And I worried that Moomin Mama was going the same way. And apparently in later books she did become an artist, but it was all very strange because then she disappeared into the pictures. Right. So that was but I never got that far when I was reading. She was always Moomin Mama, and you take her for granted, and she's infinitely wise and she knows everything. And Moomin Troll really needs her. Although he wants to go out on all these adventures and have fun, in the end he always comes back to Mum. So I just thought that was very moving. And I've got this little Moomin Mama figure who sits on my bookshelf, and she watches over me still, like the mother goddess.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because while we're in Finland, it became our mission as a family to find you a Moomin Mama, because I know that you had difficulty finding one while you were there.
Yes, I did, yes.
So we have another Moomin Mama.
Oh, wonderful.
To watch over you.
Oh, how gorgeous. Thank you so much.
So she is actually still tricky to find after all these years. So
can I open it up?
You can open it up.
Oh, wonderful.
This isn't obviously a visual medium, so we can't see.
Oh, isn't that just brilliant? I love it. Oh, there she is. She's picking berries, is she? I think it looks like she's picking berries. Yes. And there's a sun shining behind her. She looks like a kind of goddess with the sun shining on her. She has flowers in her non-existent hair. And of course, Tove Jansson, who illustrated the books as well as wrote them, this is obviously one of her wonderful drawings, because in a lot of these books, the illustrations are at least as important as the text. And this is one where the pictures are gorgeous. So thank you so much. That is just lovely. I adore it.
It's our pleasure. And I have to say that just like in the books where it feels like she's kind of there supporting everyone, and it's often hard to see her and her identity in the story, perhaps as a child. It was much the same in Finland. I'm not sure how many Moomin shops we went to just to find something of Moomin Mama.
How interesting.
She just doesn't exist on her own very often. It was a rare find. So we were really pleased to find it.
I'm really thrilled. That is just so wonderful. Yeah, and I remember she likes to decorate the gardens, and at one point they've got all this gold, and she puts gold in the garden, but not those trashy little bits of gold, only the nice large bits that look
classy.
Good. Yeah.
Seeing as Jane and I have such an affinity for Moomins, and particularly Moomin Mama, Jane's going to treat us with a bit of a read aloud from that chapter.
A while ago, I was on a cruise ship sailing around the Baltic Sea. When the ship pulled into harbour in the elegant city of Helsinki, we had a few hours for visiting, and I had a leisurely plan. Visit a couple of cathedrals that looked good in the guidebook, stroll around the harbour front, have lunch, pick up a Moomin. It was all easy, except for the Moomin, which surprised me. Here we were in Finland, home of Tove Jansson's adorable little creatures, who looked a bit like white hippos with big snouts, so you never saw their mouths. I'd known them since I was tiny, and I expected to see them all over Helsinki. Indeed, there were plenty of animal souvenirs for the tourists at the market stalls lining the harbour, but they were all elk and reindeer, elk hats, T-shirts, postcards, reindeer fridge magnets, key rings, snow domes. Not a single Moomin. I couldn't understand it. Weren't the Moomins up there with Nokia as Finland's most famous exports? Or were they all under strict copyright, only saleable through a gift shop at a Jansson museum I had yet to discover? There is a new Moomin museum in Finland, but it opened after my visit. Eventually, I found what I was looking for, more or less, almost hidden away on one market stall, 2 wooden figures, each with 3 rounded feet so you could use them to massage your aching limbs, which seemed an odd use for a Moomin. I had a choice between Moomin Troll, the son, and his mother, Moomin Mama. Once I would have chosen the son, but these days there is no question. I identify with Moomin Mama. She sits on my bookshelf now, looking at me with a typical worried expression, wearing a red and white striped apron and clutching a big black handbag. Moomin Mama, I remember, is like the Queen. She never goes anywhere without her handbag. I'll skip to the end of the chapter and just go back to that figure again after a long, long journey. I look again at my Moomin Mama on the bookshelf. Why did I choose her, not Moomin Troll? I don't know this is getting too presumptuous, but I'm thinking of Tawaret, the ancient Egyptian goddess of childbirth and fertility. She walks upright on her hind legs. She has a stubby body and a hippo face. The Egyptians made little Tawaret statues and wore Tawaret amulets. She is a nourisher and protector, especially of children. She rejuvenates the dead. Moomin Mama, please watch over me.
Well, Jane, there's so much to love about your book, Storytime, and I really appreciated the depth of the research and the synthesis that each essay presents, and it really allowed me to understand the life and times in which the author lived. And through that, I loved writing the highs and lows of your life as a reader. So thank you for your time.
Oh, absolute pleasure. I was just thrilled to talk to you, Tracy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this special edition podcast with author Jane Sullivan. Perhaps this episode has inspired you to go and revisit some of your own childhood favourites to see how these books shape the kind of reader you are today. If you want to reach out to me, you can find me at LiTracey.com.
Writers Read by LiTracey. Getting that book in children's hands. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Writers Read by LiTracey, a Dave and the Beanstalk production.